Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our weekly live podcast discussion. This is a weekly podcast interview that we do each Tuesday, same time, same place. We stream to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter X, and occasionally Instagram when the Instagram feed works. So if you're on Instagram here today, thanks for listening in. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world with their digital transformation journeys, including digital strategy, software selection, and implementation of enterprise technologies. Today's topic that we're going to dive into is manufacturing tech trends to know in 2025. So we're going to dive into this with our guest here in just a moment, who I'm going to introduce. I'm very excited to have this guest on. He's never been on this podcast before, but I've always wanted to have him on. So here he is today. I'm going to introduce him here in just a moment. Before, though, I introduce Dave to the audience, I wanted to cover a couple logistical things. First of all, as I mentioned, this is a weekly live podcast interview. You're part of the live production of our Transformation Ground Control podcast. So what we do is we film this live with the studio audience. We get your questions, and then we edit it. We add some more content to it. We release it 2 to 3 weeks later as a formal podcast episode. And you can watch that podcast by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. We've had close to 200 episodes already over the last 4 years. So you can go back and watch whatever episodes you want, and you can keep up with the new ones. So just check out transformationgroundcontrol.com for that. And then secondly, I've got a list of questions, a lot of questions. In fact, so many questions, I probably won't have time to get to them all here today. But I would really love to hear from the audience here today. So anything that, any questions you have, comments you have, things you're seeing in the industry, I'd love to hear your feedback as well. The more engaging we are here today, the more exciting it is. And of course, that's why we do these live, is to get live interaction here today. So thanks for joining. And speaking of the chat, if you just drop in the chat any questions or comments you have, again, we're watching the streams from all the platforms we're streaming to. Any questions or comments you have, please just drop those in the chat, and we'll get to those questions here. And speaking of the chat, if you don't mind dropping in the chat, what city and country are you joining from today? We tend to draw in a global audience, so I always love to see where in the world they're joining from. So what city and country are you in, if you don't mind dropping that in the chat here? So again, topic today, manufacturing tech trends to know in 2025. Joining me today for the first time, although he's not a first timer by any means, as we'll discuss here in a moment, Dave Crysler from the Crysler Club. Dave, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Eric. Excited to get into this conversation with you, and looking forward to a good one.
Yeah, likewise. This is a fun topic. I love talking about it, and I love this time of year where we start looking to the future and pulling out our crystal balls and trying to figure out what do we think is going to happen in 2025? What did we mess up in our predictions for 2024? And that sort of thing. So this will be a fun conversation here today. But before we just dive into it, though, tell me a little bit about yourself and about the Crysler Club, if you don't mind.
Yeah, happy to. So I own a boutique consulting business focused on operations. And so we work mostly with leaders in manufacturing, helping them to optimize their operations and unlock sustainable growth. So, really, what that means is bringing together the planning, people, process, and technology to move these businesses forward. And as you know, it's always a different starting point in terms of, when we enter one of these businesses. And, the goal is typically the same, but how we get there often changes.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And any certain types of manufacturing that you focus on or that you've sort of grown up in over the years?
Yeah, I spent most of my life in and around print manufacturing. So, super comfortable when it comes to custom products, made to stock, engineered to order. I've kind of worked all over the place in terms of the different sectors within manufacturing. And there's a lot of similarities that you can draw from, as you start to expand beyond that. So yeah, very fortunate to have spent my kind of growing up in two family owned businesses, kind of my harkening back to becoming an entrepreneur myself. And very fortunate to have spent the majority of my professional career working for a publicly traded company that grew through acquisition. So a lot of, although I would probably never tell you that at the time, super, super thankful for all of the challenges that I was given throughout that time frame, because it's really the stuff that allowed me to, tap into the things that not only do I love to do, just got a lot of practice and a lot of different experiences to be able to pull from, to help clients out today.
Yeah. So is it that family business upbringing that sort of led you to manufacturing? I was reading about that a little bit on your LinkedIn profile. But is
Yeah.
that for how you ended up in the manufacturing space?
Yeah, I mean, I've been in and around it really my entire life. So, my parents owned two different printing companies as I was growing up. And so it's like I talk about it and my origin story, right? But like a lot of our weekends and nights were spent, at the shop. So I
Mm.
just thought that was normal. I thought that's how, everybody grew up and running around machines and seeing things work and how things came together in that manufacturing environment. And, it didn't really, early on in my career, it was interesting because, I can kind of distinctly remember this shift of saying, like, oh, what we do is special. We're different, and then this shift being, this really is just a widget, and you hear a lot of people kind of talk about manufacturing and the things that they do as being unique and special. And, while some of that could be true, the broader perspective is how can we take a look at this thing and break it down into those kind of process touch points, the technology that ultimately enables our people and process to succeed. And it was really interesting for me to, having spent all my life kind of growing up in this thought process of like, oh, what we do is different, we're unique, what we create, everything is you know custom, to the shift of looking at it from that manufacturing
Mm.
perspective, and being able to pull from those two different pretty distinct perspectives, because a lot of the clients that we're interfacing with today have that same thought process. So it's allowed me to kind of tell a better story in terms of how we can take some of the planning, people, process, technology, and pull that together, ultimately to drive results for the people that we're working with.
Yeah, that's very cool. So what started off as free child labor for your parents turned into
Exactly.
a lifelong passion for a career in manufacturing.
Exactly.
Little did they know.
Yep,
But
yep.
that's awesome. Well, very cool. See, it's in your blood. You've been doing this for a while, and you're the perfect candidate to be talking about this stuff. So, as we sort of look to where we're headed right now, just in the future, sort of forward looking, what are some of the trends you're seeing in the manufacturing space right now? I know you were just talking about sort of that those custom products and that sort of thing. Is that one of them, or do you have other trends that you're seeing in the marketplace right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that never goes away is the advancements in technology. So in terms of what I'm seeing, it's companies that are constantly looking towards, their tool set and revising their tool set. And the thing that I really pull from is it's not so much the tool, right? We obviously have to understand and unpack what's the most appropriate tool, but far too often we kind of lean into that versus leaning into that planning, people, process, which are really the ultimate drivers. So, I think that's the biggest trend is, people are talking more about AI, ML, all of the different tool sets that are available. And, what's really underneath all of that is that infrastructure that's going to support those things. So again, we don't have the planning, people, process, if we don't have data integrity, if we don't have data governance, the really cool stuff that's out there that everybody wants to talk about is going to be really challenging to be able to implement successfully.
Mm,
And I think that's really the contributing factor, like the leading contributing factor to the stats that you still see in terms of, transformation, adoption, failure rates, all of those things that we deal with, on a constant basis.
right. Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. You mentioned AI. I was going to see how long we could go in this conversation without talking about AI, but it's
Yeah.
impossible. Let's just
It's
embrace it. We'll just jump into it.
Yeah, it
But
it really is, like, again, it's a point of contention for everybody that's out there. But I think, more broadly speaking, people are thinking, at least the people I'm interfacing with, they're thinking that they're being left behind because they've not already implemented something, or potentially, their tech stack, right? And it doesn't matter what we're talking about, could be, ERP, WMS, MRP, whatever they're working with. Chances are that tool set is already starting to introduce some of these things. So it's we can't get away from it. We can't get around it. But
Right.
I do think, it is our kind of duty and responsibility to talk about what makes it successful, and to also help people understand that, just because there's a lot of conversation around it doesn't mean that every competitor in your space has already implemented it. And if they
Right.
have, chances are they probably don't have a really strong strategy behind it. Right.
Right. Yeah, it's a good point. And you have to look at the vendors too. Software vendors are always going to be light years ahead of where the average manufacturer is. So while they're talking about it, they're excited about it, they're embracing it, investing heavily in it. Doesn't mean you should ignore it, but it also doesn't mean you need to be right there with them on the bleeding edge of
Yes.
AI adoption. I think that's probably a good takeaway there too.
Yeah.
Just a couple. I want to come to a audience comment here that I think
Yeah.
is interesting. This is from before I get to that though, Jonathan on LinkedIn from Greensville, South Carolina. Thank you for being here today. Here's an interesting comment from James Roloff on LinkedIn. Great point. AI and machine learning has reignited the flame of shiny object syndrome. So that's the last thing we need is more shiny objects, more sexy technologies that we don't know what to do with. But
Yeah.
here we are. That's what we've got. So we've got to figure out how it fits in. But sort of and then one more comment here from Anders on LinkedIn. Anders says everyone wants AI supply chain predictions. No one wants to do the work to get data from reality in the system so that algorithms can look at it. Great point. I mean, I think that if there's a silver lining or a unintended silver lining of AI, it's that it's forcing manufacturers and other organizations to clean up their data and do some of this really
Yes.
foundational stuff they should have been doing all along. But if AI is what it takes for people to focus on it, then great. But to Andrew's point, it's not easy to adopt or to adapt AI technology if you don't have the foundation in place.
Yeah. Yeah.
What
100%.
what are you seeing with like how are you seeing manufacturers respond to AI? Like in general, like are you seeing them come up with some limited use cases or pilots? Are they just talking about it? Are they skeptical about it? Do you see some that are fully embracing it? I know you said most of them aren't, but what are you seeing just overall with manufacturers you work with and as it relates to AI?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, people are talking about it, interested in it, trying to figure out where it fits into the strategy and how they can ultimately leverage the insights that it kind of promises, right? But very quickly those conversations turn right back to what we already unpacked. It's the data governance, the data integrity that is going to drive all of those things. So it's very much the crawl walk run scenario. How do we get back to basics? How do we ensure that we have integrity and governance throughout our organization? And depending on the size of your organization, that becomes kind of exponentially challenging, right? If you take a global organization that has multiple business units, multiple tech stacks within those business units, that's continuing to do acquisition, that's a different conversation than an SMB manufacturer, one or two location with a consolidated tech stack. So different challenge sets though, right? Because generally in that SMB space, you probably have far fewer IT resources to be able to deploy to understand, do we have data governance? Do we have data integrity? How do we put this into strategy from a kind of cross-functional, C-suite to down the line tactical perspective versus again those enterprise businesses that for sure have the resources available, but again becomes a spider web of where do we start? How do we actually move the needle? And I think that's where the conversation ultimately lies with a lot of the people I'm interfacing with. It's where do we start? How do we know that this is going to move the needle? How do we some way hedge against Anders point, the shiny object syndrome? Is this going to be something that ultimately helps us, or is this just one more thing that 6 months, 18 months, whatever, is going to be replaced again? So I think that's, more broadly speaking, that's the stuff that I'm seeing. And then there's different subsets of that, obviously, right? So I think another way to talk about the advancements of technology and what I am seeing manufacturers take a look at is some of the process automation once they've gone through and done, some of that underlying and foundational work. So, whether that's kind of low code, no code stuff that, Zapier, Make, all of the tools that are widely available to really anybody, up through full, RPA solutions with an outsourced partner, and people are doing some really great things in both of those camps. So I think that's a whole other layer to this similar conversation that people might not be 100% familiar with. Or again, where do we start? How do we know this is going to help, move the needle for us?
Right. Yeah. No, it makes total sense. Um, what about so as it relates to some of this cleanup and data governance, as you mentioned, and some of this foundational stuff you have to have in place? Um, that brings up another question that's somewhat related to AI around real time data and analytics. Um, how would you assess the status and the state of the union as it relates to manufacturers and their ability to get real time data and analytics and to have that sort of more information, not just dirty data, but actual information they can glean from the system? How would you sort of assess or generalize where manufacturers are in that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I would say generally speaking, the folks that I see, and again, across the spectrum in terms of size of organization, but I would say generally speaking, people are further behind than one might believe. And
Mm,
what I really mean by that is, you can look at any kind of source. It could be social, it could be one of the big four, it could be, really any place. And when you read those headlines, when you read some of these white papers, you really feel like everybody is doing this. Like everybody
yeah,
has real time access to data. Everybody has dashboards available. And very quickly when you're in these organizations and you understand and start to unpack what the real challenges are, you kind of very quickly see that that is a very, very small subset of companies today that have these solutions implemented. And if they do have those solutions implemented, in terms of leveraging them, I'd still say that there's a pretty significant gap
mm,
of, we have the ability to take a look at this, but again, are we looking at the right metrics, the right KPIs, or are we looking at kind of the predefined dashboard? Yes, we're measuring these things, but ultimately we're still struggling with the same challenges, right? We're struggling to gain market share. We're struggling to increase profitability. Our cash flow is strapped. We're still having quality issues, right? So to me, again, you have to look at that, from two different perspectives and say, you know, can the tech support it? Number one. And that's a conversation in and of itself. And if the tech can support it, are we looking at the right things? Are we able to measure the ultimate drivers for our particular businesses, given where we're at in the market and where we're trying to move towards?
right. Yeah, that's a really important point. That last point, super important. How you align with what it is you're trying to do. I mean, if it
Yeah.
doesn't fit with what you're trying to do as a manufacturing organization, that's just a bunch of noise. All the cool
Yeah.
technologies. I mean, think of all the technologies that are really cool and emerging and advanced that you will never need or want in your organization. And
Yeah.
and you could get overwhelmed and bogged down by getting too caught up in that. So I think it's a really good point. Just focus on like where you're going as a manufacturing organization and what technology is going to best help you get there, and what's the priorities of how you roll out those technologies, because you can't do it all at once.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I always use the example of the crawl, walk, run, right? And pick on just a quick story here, but pick on, let's say, quality management for manufacturers. And could you have a fully integrated QMS that has IoT devices and real time dashboards to monitor for one of a million different KPIs? Yes, you absolutely can, and it is the coolest stuff that you'll ever see, right?
Right.
You can also track it, totally manually, right? And while those two examples are miles apart, what you really should be asking yourself is, what do we have in place now? What are we trying to understand in terms of what we're tracking, and how ultimately does that move us forward towards our goal, right? So while you can have all kinds of conversations, build out a budget and do a project management change implementation for that really cool Ferrari of a system, that might not be in your best interest, right? It might be in your best interest, at least in the interim, to grab, a yellow legal pad and start writing down every time you make a mistake. It's
Yeah.
something literally that simple. And obviously I'm really simplifying this for people, but I like to try to use those two vastly different scenarios because too often we're so focused on the tool, we're so focused on the execution, we forget about that planning people process part. We forget about what are we trying to do to actually move the needle here, or are we just looking at the coolest thing that we could possibly build out and implement, and having a bunch of meetings in and around that ultimately come to the conclusion that ah, you know this is probably going to be too much for us.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also getting past that mindset or that flawed view that, oh, if I use a yellow legal pad, pen and paper, that's a bad thing. I mean, sure, it'd be nice if you had a tool set there, and maybe eventually
Sure.
you will have a tool set, but if it's working for you, it's efficient enough, then and I know it's an extreme example you're giving there
It
with a
is,
pad,
yeah.
pen and paper, but it's sort of the point is well made that, you want to use technology selectively and strategically, not just arbitrarily and universally across the entire company.
Yeah.
Um, Here's kind of related to this forward-looking trends with where manufacturers are headed and their maturity in adopting some of these technologies. This is from Dan Aldridge on YouTube. I think you know him as well, Dave. He seems
I
to
do,
know
yeah.
us, and I know him well too. Um, so Dan says two of my favorite ERP and manufacturing experts. Thank you for that.
Yeah,
Do you
thanks,
think
Dan.
building microservices or composable apps with AI enabled in manufacturing is relatively more important than upgrading to cloud ERP? So he's coming in hot with a very not a controversial question, but it's kind of that's a meaty question there. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, again, I go by use case, right? So there's a case to be made for every manufacturer for every scenario, and there's a lot of complexities in and around that question. I wish it was black and white, right? But there's
Yeah,
just so many shades of gray with this stuff. It depends on, and I'll just give you a few, right? Like from my perspective, depends on current org structure, depends on growth strategy. Are you planning to acquire other businesses? How does that ultimately fit into what you're doing today, both from the tech stack perspective and how you're going to implement or integrate, right? And the rest of your growth strategy. There's just so much to unpack with that little bit of question, but at a high level, I'm a real fan of understanding what that problem is, and kind of what's the path of least resistance to address it. Right.
mm,
So again, I'll go back to my extreme examples of the yellow legal pad versus, the Ferrari of the fully integrated system. And it's kind of the argument of best in class versus, fully integrated. Right.
right,
Um, if the yellow legal pad will suffice us to deliver the KPIs we need to measure and ultimately yield the progress we're hoping to make, why would we do anything different? you know
right,
so again, in Dan's question, if the offline or kind of third party app will suffice to do that, and we don't require an integration, we don't require it to be in a feature set of the ERP for one of a number of reasons. Why would we look at that? It just doesn't
yeah,
make sense. It's back to the you know one solution fits everybody, and that's just never the case. I think it's why we align so much on the agnostic approach, because if you ask a software vendor, and I don't care what vendor it is, um, your problem can be solved through that software,
of
right?
course,
Doesn't
yeah,
matter who it is, and it doesn't matter what the stack is, and I think that's the real challenge with it, right? So you need to understand where we at, where we trying to go, what are the complexities, who's involved, how does this fit into the bigger picture before you can start to say like, oh, here's the narrow selection of things we could try, right? And
right.
that's yellow legal pad to Ferrari integrated system.
Yeah, and I think you have to really take with a grain of salt some of that call it purist judgment that comes from vendors that say, "Wait, you're using a paper and pen to do what? You're so outdated. You're going to be out of business in a couple
Yeah.
years if you keep doing that." You create this fear, this uncertainty, and
Yeah.
sure, like I said, of course, if you're using pen and paper, yeah, there's an opportunity for you to make that a lot more efficient and be
Yep.
more profitable, but it doesn't mean you need to put the entire organization at risk.
Yeah.
Um,
And
and
look at, look at Kanban, right? Like, I mean, look at there are multi-million dollar factories running on Kanban, like
yeah,
manual Kanban.
yeah,
So you can't tell me that paper and pen doesn't work, right? Like
yeah,
it's been, disproven. And sure, you can make the efficiency argument, totally agree with that, right? But there's a huge difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Everybody knows that. I'm striving for effectiveness. Sometimes that means we're not the most efficient in a particular spot, right? Because ultimately we're seeking effectiveness.
right.
So again, there's so many sides to all this. That's why I love this stuff. You can really unpack and get in the weeds with it.
Well, it's fun about being tech agnostic like you and I because we're not part of the vendor sales machine. Is we can ask questions like these. We can have conversations like, is a pen and paper bad?
Yeah.
I think if we had a vendor on here, they say absolutely that is terrible. But
Yes.
you and I can say, well, hold on, let's think about that. I mean, it depends on what your priorities are, and Dan.
Absolutely.
By the way, Dan likes the it depends answer. I get that all the time.
I
But
think unfortunately that's the default consultant answer. But it's too appropriate to not use because it really does. There's a lot of things to unpack. And if it were just black and white, then you could literally go and, pick whatever tool it is you want, implement that, and you'd have 100% success rate. And that's just not the case.
yeah, 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 that's a very good point. So what about, the reason I think of this question is because as we're talking, I'm thinking about how in some ways you and I right now are poking the bear a little bit. Like we're sort of we're saying the non-popular opinions maybe in some ways in our, in the tech industry. But when you think about cloud, one of my favorite topics to post about is the cloud. And I love to be contrarian about cloud and talk about how actually it's not cheaper than on-prem. It costs you
Yeah.
more. It might deliver more value, but it's going to cost you more. And I get such a negative reaction from the industry, but then I also get it's like half and half. Half the people in the industry like completely think I'm way out in left field and I have no idea what I'm talking about, and the other half of the people say, "No, you're right, it's true," and whatever. I like calling it out not just because I like to create controversy, because I think it's
Yeah.
worth having these conversations. Like, let's talk about what's really happening, what's really
Yes.
relevant to manufacturers today. But let's look at cloud for a minute, just not only because it's controversial at times, but how are you seeing manufacturing adoption of cloud, just cloud technologies in general? Are you seeing a lot of them still sort of stuck on-prem, having trouble getting to cloud, or most of them sort of all in on the cloud movement, or what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, people are certainly open to it as it makes sense, for selection and implementation. And to your point, like again, I think we align a bit on this. Years ago I had this was kind of before the really big push to the cloud. This was probably 15 years ago, give or take. We had a mission critical process that we ultimately moved to the cloud in a business I was responsible for. And, again, on the surface, this is amazing, right? All of these feature sets open up. We now have the ability to share workload. We can, have catastrophic backup and, disaster recovery mitigation. We've got all of these different things that we can take advantage of because of this. The thing ultimately that we were able to unpack with it is while we did have that, the thing that nobody wanted to talk about, we kind of started to experience, right? Service outages, issues in terms of having to constantly restart virtual machines where, again, this mission critical workflow lived within. So every time this thing went down, it was a big issue within the facility. And while I would say that some of those things probably are, better addressed today, doesn't matter the tool set, you still see downs, you still see outages. And so, like you, I say you have to be cautiously optimistic. You have to understand what the downside, what the risk is. And there's risks on both sides, from cloud and on-prem. So yeah, that's, just a bit of, my personal experience,
Mhm.
and also what I see in the industry. Like, I don't think people are afraid of it. I think if anything, people should be a bit more cautious just from the perspective of understanding where your data lives, who has access to that data, I would say very few companies are really reading all of the fine print and things that they're signing off on when they sign up for these types of services. And so you've got to be mindful of those things. Who ultimately has access to it, what kind of risks your business are in. I mean, imagine, having a mission critical process like, accounts receivable live in that infrastructure and not being able to invoice for a period of time. That could be an
Right.
hour, that could be a week, right? Depending on
Right.
what kind of outage we're talking about, and depending on who you're ultimately utilizing to build out that infrastructure, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's so true. It's there's still an underlying fear there, especially when you have like the CrowdStrike slash Microsoft issue that happened
Yeah.
a few months ago. And then you start to wonder, like, okay, what is our backup plan if those systems go down? Do we have some redundancy built in? Do we have too much vendor lock in or eggs in one basket of one vendor to where if there's a vendor disruption, we've now put our entire operations at risk? I mean, those are the sorts of things you have to think about. And that's why sometimes these multi-cloud environments can make sense. That's why sometimes best of breed, having
Yeah.
multiple systems do multiple things can be good because now you're diversifying your risk. Not to mention someday when it comes time to replace that technology with a new one, you're not having to rip out the entire thing. You can do it in a more isolated fashion. So there are benefits of diversifying and really being a bit cautious, like as you suggest, which I totally agree with. I think that's a great approach.
Yeah.
Um, Here's a question. This is a little. I'm gonna dance around the political aspect of this and try and get to the meat of the question here. And it's not going to show on the screen, unfortunately. It's only going to show the controversial, the sort of the political side of it.
Sure.
But I'm going to read the whole thing anyway. I'm going to hone in on one part of this, which I think is a really good point. And I think the context here of where he's coming from, and this is from Dan on LinkedIn, but where he's coming from, I think is really interesting. And I think this is an interesting question. So Dan
Yeah.
says it's not just AI; it's also geopolitical risk. Israel's pager attack in Lebanon is already blowing back on Western manufacturing. Western tech cannot be trusted anymore. The pager attack will influence international business and remake global supply chains, benefiting China. Again, I'm going to stay away from the war and politics and all that stuff, even though I'm sure we all have strong opinions on that. But where I really want to go with this is organizations will need to navigate supply chain disruptions and will require regional geopolitical risk assessments. What are your thoughts on that? Because I think that's a really interesting point where, you think about technology and where the technology is and just supply chains, global supply chains, and how all this stuff, this crazy stuff happening in the world is creating disruption. So how are you seeing manufacturers like trying to hedge against that risk of geopolitical risk, economic risk, and just trying to figure out how to manage these complex global supply chains in that context?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly frank, I wish more manufacturers were concerned with this.
Mhm.
This is a huge gap that I see, and try to highlight depending on where the conversation starts. I'll give you an example. I've got a manufacturer that we're working with on some of their QMS documentation. And this is something we talk about a lot. They've got a global supply chain. They're in a very unique business with the very few suppliers globally that can supply what they're bringing in and ultimately manufacturing. And you know it's it's never something that you want to kind of lead with, right? But that's the reality that we live in today. And if we saw anything or take kind of anything away from the pandemic, and the disruptions that continue to happen, whether it's due to something like that, something geopolitical, something even back to labor issues, right? With folks being on strike and goods coming into the country. This is something that should be top of mind for people, and be having conversations around, be trying to hedge against. Again, taking a look at kind of the SMB versus enterprise space, I would say that there's more conversations happening in the enterprise space.
Yeah.
It becomes much more complex to deal with and to mitigate against because of their supply chain. In that SMB and mid market size companies, I wish there were more conversations around it. It's a huge gap. Could potentially cripple your business, and people, don't give it as much thought, I believe, as they should.
Yeah, especially with COVID. I mean, I think if anything, COVID in 2020 should have reminded us all or made us all aware how fragile these global supply chains are and how disruptive it could be when just one piece of that supply chain breaks. And when you've got a single point of failure, a la one vendor, as you're talking about, you sole source one key raw material to one vendor that's based in some part of the world that might experience some sort of geopolitical issue or, macroeconomic or financial issue. There's a lot of risk there. So really hedging, not just with technology, but also just
Yeah.
the way you've designed your supply chain, your manufacturing operations and all that stuff. Back to your, what'd you call planning
Yeah.
people process.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That stuff will help navigate more effectively than just technology alone, for sure.
Yeah.
Um, Here's a question from Darian on LinkedIn. What advice would you give manufacturers looking to modernize their operations through digital transformation?
Yeah, great question, Darian. I mean, again, depends on where you're starting from, how mature your organization is today. For me, the starting point is always, planning people process, right? So taking a look and doing a gap assessment on how mature your organization is from a process perspective, and then taking a look at how does your technology or your tech stack, how do we utilize that to enable what we're doing from, the planning people process perspective. So again, if you're a mid-sized manufacturer that has an ERP or MIS or some sort of tech stack that you've already implemented, what are the big gaps, right? What do you see? What are we working towards? Do we have, productivity issues, efficiency, effectiveness, utilization? Do we have quality challenges, right? How can we take a look at that? Maybe it's something as simple as, inventory management or, our procurement processes. So again, for me, I'm always looking at what's the process gap and how mature are we today? What's our growth strategy look like? Again, are we in acquisition mode? Are we just looking to gain market share by expanding our product line? Maybe we're not expanding our product line. That's locked in. We need to figure out, a better sales and marketing strategy. All of
Right.
those factors for me start the conversation around digital transformation, right? A lot of people I feel like say, the conversation starts with, well, what ERP environment are you in? Well, we got to get you in NetSuite. We got to get you in fill in the blank, right? None
Hmm.
of that stuff to me matters nearly as much as talking about your planning people and process. Those are the drivers. Those are the things that are going to make your transformation succeed or fail. And you need each one of those things before you could ever think about implementing or upgrading or selecting a more appropriate tool to ultimately enable those first three things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's sound advice for sure. What about this? This is also from Dan on YouTube. Dan says, "Are you seeing smart factory initiatives being done alongside cloud ERP upgrades as part of a business or digital transformation project?" And maybe for those of us that don't know, could you maybe just explain real quickly what smart factory is and how you're seeing that evolve in the manufacturing space?
Yeah, I mean, again, different levels of this, but basically what we're talking about is, looking at devices like IIoT, so industrial Internet of Thing devices, which is basically a fancy way to say, connectivity,
Mm,
right? And there's all kinds of different layers to that. Again, I go back, for the kind of maturity conversation, right? Understanding if we are process and tech mature today, implementing smart factory along with a upgrade or as a standalone project in a lot of cases will make tons of sense, right? Like we can take a look at, a 24/7 operation that is, struggling from a preventative or planned maintenance scenario and implementing some key IIoT devices, reducing that unplanned downtime, significantly, right? Things like that can make a huge difference in your business. But again, what's the overall strategy? What are we trying to solve for here? So it's not, again, I want to be mindful to say it's not just about implementing the smart tech, but is that smart tech going to enable us to solve a real problem? Do we have a real business case here? Or are we a company and again, I'll throw this out there because I've seen some of these companies and they're fun to work with, right? We want to be on the cutting edge of these, technologies, tool sets. That's awesome, right?
Right.
There's a lot of cool things you can do, but recognize that that's where you want to be and that's how you want to position yourself in the market versus, if you are, let's say, just struggling from a consistency perspective, right? That's not going to be our first option. That's not going to be the thing that we're going to lead with. Okay. Let's get some consistency in place. Let's leave that smart tech, some of the really great digital transformation initiatives. Let's leave that for down the road a bit because we're going to get there, right? At some point we're going to run out of other things to fix and then we're going to need some more things,
Right.
right? So it's the cycle of continuous improvement, but it always starts with the assessment of where are we at today, where do we want to be, and how do those things align with our strategy to say how do we prioritize these things. It can for sure be on the list, but depending on those other things, it might need to be further down on the list.
Right. Come back to Dan Aldridge's point here. Great answer. It depends. I'm just going to keep coming back to that because I think a lot of these questions, a lot of questions I have for you here today are going to be, it depends. It depends what you're trying to do. And I think that's actually a really important takeaway. Kidding aside, it does depend. A lot of these,
Yeah.
even though we like to talk about trends, and I'm the one that said, hey, Dave, let's get on this podcast and talk about trends and where things are going. Let's get out our crystal ball. As much as you and I try, at the end of the day, it does depend. It depends on what a manufacturer wants and needs, and that's what matters more than the overall trends in the market, in my opinion. But
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And the other thing I would add is, right, like that's why people should be having conversations with folks like us. And,
mhm,
I know you do a lot of, kind of pro bono and just conversations. Like more
yeah,
knowledge is always better. It doesn't mean you've got to engage somebody, but it should mean that you should be talking through these things, talking through your ideas, talking through what that strategy looks like. And understanding, again, some of the questions that are being asked here. Amazing, great questions. um you know but again, don't be afraid to have the conversation and get some additional insights from folks that are interfacing with many other businesses to make sure that it's not shiny object syndrome, that I just want to be part of the pack, and that there's a real business case to be made for XYZ, whatever it is we're talking about.
right, right. So we've talked about shiny object syndrome, as you just mentioned again, and we've talked about the need to make sure that you deploy technology that aligns with and fits your overarching strategy. What are some of the other, besides those two things and other things we've talked about here today? What are some of the biggest challenges manufacturers face when they're implementing new technologies? What are those big obstacles and pitfalls that they tend to run into when they're going through this sort of transformation?
Yeah, to me, the two, kind of key drivers are back to data and people. The change management aspect, oftentimes we're starting far too late in the transformation journey to really bring people into the conversation and along for that journey. Ultimately leads to a lot of turnover, a lot of disruption, internal and external. And the other piece is the data, and we already talked about that. So I don't want to, kind of rehash what we've said.
Sure.
But I think those are the two key drivers for any initiative, any change initiative. If we're not talking about, why from a people perspective, why are we doing this? What do we anticipate is, going to be the impact to our people? Because that's really what people are concerned about, right? What's the impact to me? How is this going to make my life any easier? Am I just going to have more stuff to do? Right. So answering those questions, early and often, and then again, addressing some of the data, understanding where we at from a data maturity standpoint today, what kinds of things, kind of given time and money, no object, like what are the things we would love to be able to look at, would love to be able to measure, love to be able to understand about our business, starting from those, conversation points, and then letting those two things kind of lead the rest of the way. For me, that's what makes a successful transformation, a successful change initiative. Those two things alone.
Yeah, I agree with you. Those are two huge ones. I might add, risk management. How do you do
Yeah.
everything you just said? How do you do all that without disrupting your day-to-day operations? Because the last thing any of us want as a manufacturer is to not be able to ship product, or
Yeah.
not be able to find our inventory, or know where our inventory is, and that sort of thing. So we need to make sure we've got a measured strategy and plan that mitigates risk, that isn't moving at such a breakneck speed that we don't have time to do all the things you just said, which
Yeah.
what you just said, by the way, that takes time. And that's
Yes.
usually not what the software vendors focus on. So they're going to come in from a different angle and say, hey, let's slam in this technology. We can deploy it in X amount of time. But that doesn't consider the things you're talking about. And the things you're talking about are going to determine success or failure. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. I mean, back to your point about risk, right? Like, again, on the surface, all of that sounds amazing, right? But if we can't take care of the customer, if we can't, invoice, can't deliver product, none of it matters, right? Because we're going to be in a completely different scenario trying to dig out than just a transformation project.
Right.
So yeah, it's a great point from a risk mitigation standpoint, and let your organization lead the change, right? Too often, I think we kind of acquiesce to um, you know what the vendors maybe prefer from a timeline perspective, because
Yeah.
again, you don't know what you don't know. If you've never done one of these projects, it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge. It's a lot of moving parts, a lot of moving pieces, and there's a lot of considerations to be made before you even do any of the the kind of real work.
Yeah. Yeah.
So don't be afraid to have those conversations and give some pushback. That's some other advice that I would give to people. Again, engaging folks like yourself, like myself, that have been through these things, can help give some guidance as to what's acceptable. How does that really work? And kind of what leverage do you have? Um, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. That's and just, it doesn't have to be a bad thing or a adversarial sort of
yeah,
discussion either. It's more like, hey, does this make sense for us? Or, do we really need to do this, this, and that? Or why? You mentioned why earlier. Why are we doing this, this, and that? And a lot of times organizations, even at the leadership level, can't answer that question themselves, let alone communicate it clearly to the rest of the organization. So I think asking questions helps you determine the why, even if you land exactly where the vendor wanted
yes,
you to land, which is rare, by the way. But let's just say you end up landing back there. At least you've sort of done your due diligence. You've asked good questions. You've gotten different viewpoints and perspectives, and you know what the risks are. And that's the big thing, is knowing that no matter what direction we do, what decisions we make, there are going to be risks, and there's no easy trade-off. There's no silver bullet, which I know you
yeah,
talk a lot about in your content too. There's no silver bullet. I think that was
yeah.
one of the most recent videos I saw from you about that.
Yeah, everybody would like there to be one, myself included. That's just not the reality. And I think you made a great point back to the kind of why question, especially from a senior leadership perspective. To me, it all gets back to how this conversation started in terms of what are the trends that we see. I
Mhm.
think a lot of the conversation, especially at the senior leadership level, centers around what are other people doing? What are those trends? We don't want to be last on the list. And the reality again is that I think there's a lot of um, conversation in the marketplace that would lead people to believe everybody has already done this. You're 3 years behind the times. You're never going to continue growing your business without these things. Right. And that's just, we know that's not the reality, but it's very easy to be, I think, persuaded into that thinking based on the things that you see and read on a daily basis. So again, having a strong why, having conversations internally to unpack and understand, like, what are the roadblocks that our people are facing. So often I go into an organization where that senior leadership team is, even if they've grown up in that business, let's say, is far removed from the things and challenges that the team is faced with, that just doing some of that and having some more open kind of conversation, town halls, if you will,
Mm.
would drive so much more value and results for the organization, than some of the other conversations that are happening.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. And I have to give my marketing team a hard time here for a moment, because someone let a vendor in the room in the stream here. This is from Terry on LinkedIn. Terry says, reach out to me to find out more about the Cosmo to Go discrete manufacturing. Thanks for joining, Terry. I'm not familiar with your product, but here's some free publicity for you. Cosmo to Go discrete manufacturing. Um, This is from Derek on LinkedIn. Hey, Dave Chrysler. Hope you're doing well.
Good deal. Hey, Derek.
And then Derek has a question that he follows up with after saying hello to you, Dave. He says, totally agree. Your company should be able to manifest some sort of direction or standard and should not wholly rely on vendors or customers to dictate that. This is why companies have a byproduct of their collective expertise. And I think this is a really good point. I like this comment because I don't know about you, Dave, but I feel like a lot of manufacturers, and not this isn't just limited to manufacturing. This is more of a broad global statement I'll make here. But I feel like a lot of organizations lose control of their technology initiatives, and they sort of have this outsourcing mentality because they're manufacturers, they're not tech companies, and
Yeah.
after all, the tech vendors do this every day. We don't. We're a manufacturing company. We make stuff. So let's let the tech people do what they're good at. And you sort of have this learned helplessness that unintentionally comes along with that. Is that something you see, or if so, how do you see your clients and your manufacturing context overcome that dynamic?
Yeah, it's a great question and a good point. It's certainly a challenge with the folks that I interface with, and again, it's kind of at all different sizes of business, different challenges, right? Again, back to that SMB and even into the mid market space. They're challenged from a resource load perspective. So of course, that's not their core competency. It makes sense to outsource. The challenge again is finding the right partner to outsource. So outsource isn't a bad thing. It's all about understanding. Back to some of our earlier points, right? What's the good and the bad? What's the risk with outsourcing? Who am I partnering with? What's their experience? How can they bring some of that, transferable experience and practical application into this environment to help me manage not just the stack, right? But how the stack fits in with the planning people process, right? How we utilize the stack to ultimately, enable those other pieces of the business, ultimately, tapping into the strategy and driving growth, right?
Right.
In the larger companies, again, don't see nearly as much of the outsource perspective, but they have a different challenge that I often see. And that's just getting their hands around all of the different tool sets, all of the different business use cases, and then managing and prioritizing, right? Because inevitably in that environment, they've got people at all different layers of the organization coming to them and saying like, I need a tool for this. I need a tool for that. I need to use this thing. Can I get a license for it? And so it very quickly escalates to understanding, what's the use case? What tool set do we have that's existing? Will that tool set suffice for this thing? And, unfortunately, from a resource perspective, a lot of those companies don't have, while they may have like a mature and sizable department to deal with that, chances are they don't have a sizable department to kind of unpack process optimization and understanding like, okay, you say these things about this process, this tool set. Let's get into that a bit deeper, right? To really help facilitate where the most appropriate scenario ends up being. So I think outsource is never a bad thing, but understand who you're partnering with and what their expertise is. I would never, myself be relying solely on vendor partners without having some sort of intermediary there, because you need, in my opinion, a neutral third party that has no skin in the game in terms of, being compensated from the software vendor, right? But has no skin in the game other than driving, that business forward and solving the problems that that business faces. So, and,
Yeah.
that's not a plug for me, right? Like that's literally anybody. There's a bunch of amazing talented independent consultants out there that could for sure give you some perspective and weigh in on these things. So that's what I would lobby for manufacturers and more broadly companies of all sizes.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Just to kind of tilt the playing field. I agree with you, by the way, that outsourcing is not a bad thing in moderation, just like anything,
Yeah.
of course. But it's, as long as you have ownership and decision making, and you're engaged and you're directing, you're not being directed. So there's a difference between outsourcing and who's in charge or in control. And maybe that's where I was blurring the lines a little bit in my comment earlier. But I think when you talk about outsourcing, that's fine. But because you need third parties, you need to bring in that outside expertise. And so in essence, you have to outsource to some degree. But where executives tend to get into trouble in manufacturing organizations is they they sort of relegate responsibility and decision making to the consultants. We have this one client. It's a really big manufacturing company, and they are working with one of the really big consulting firms that we've all heard of, and they're implementing SAP. And they signed a contract with that big consulting firm, the big system integrator, who we all know who they are. We would know the name if I said it.
Yep.
Um, and that system integrator insisted that the contract read and clarify that the system integrator, not the manufacturer, but the system integrator had final decision-making authority on the project. And if they
Oh,
didn't,
that's
I know, and if they didn't get it, they were going to walk away and not do the project.
wow.
And they signed that contract right before they hired us. And so then we come in and we're like, wait, hold on, you agreed to what? That is a terrible idea. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a pretty extreme example, but it's a reflection of reality of how a lot of times system integrators think, and a lot of times how manufacturers think, which is, well, they are the expert and we can't do it without them. So we better
I,
just let them sort of run with this.
yeah. To that point, exactly. Right. Like, they may be the experts, but they're the experts within a very narrow subset. You are the expert of your business, right? So there's a huge difference in best in class from a solution perspective and best in class within your organization. And if you're an organization that, embraces continuous improvement and looking for best in class ways to to deliver your products, right? There is no expert that you could bring in that is better than you. Right?
Right.
And I would even say, like, internally, right? From a leadership perspective, you can't fully relegate those responsibilities to a department, right? You still have to be involved, from a strategic direction perspective. So yeah, that is a wild story that would be allowed to happen. And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate, really. That's the sad reality. It's unfortunate that is the scenario, and hopefully you guys are able to, um, you know, work collectively to do right by the client.
Yeah.
But that certainly is not a guarantee given what you just shared.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe a follow-up podcast topic could be
Yeah,
craziest manufacturing stories ever, and you and I can
that's a
just
good
sit here
one.
and riff and talk about it, the craziest stories we've heard about in the space. But yeah, unfortunately, I wish I was making that up, but
Yeah,
it baffles me sometimes some of the things that happen in this space. But what about there's a couple of directions I want to go here, so bear with me for a second. But
yeah.
we talked earlier about change management and in people. You talk about planning, people, process. Tell us a little bit more about that. In a typical manufacturing organization, if there is such a thing, um, what are some of the best practices or pitfalls or lessons you have from helping companies navigate the people aspect of their transformations?
Yeah, I mean, everybody starts in a different place, right? It's back to that process and tech maturity. Oftentimes, especially in a manufacturing environment, you're coming in and you've got, people that have kind of been there forever, in different levels, right? And so understanding again, what are those roadblocks, really listening. I think that's probably the best lesson, as simple as it is, the best lesson that I learned in my own leadership career and running, several manufacturing organizations and now, interfacing with them from an independent consulting standpoint. It's literally just using both of your ears, actively engaged in a conversation to understand what are the things that are slowing you down, and then prioritizing those things. Too often
Mm,
we are, focused on the response and focused on getting people aligned with us from a direction perspective. And yes, from a leadership standpoint, you have to have that strategic direction, you have to have the goal, you have to have the bounds. But within that, you've got to be able to listen to people, help them to, unpack and understand how what they're saying and what that feedback is fits into that strategic vision and fits within the bounds.
mm,
I heard this really great phrase from somebody, And, a lot of times we'll talk about, let's have a brainstorming session, right?
Right.
And, we've all heard that. We've all done that. We've all had the, stand up meetings and town hall meetings to do that. And the phrase was, let's do a try storming session. And the
Try
try
some.
storming is literally about trying the ideas that people are giving, because what ultimately happens is you bring them along this journey of improvement, right? And all change is driven from that. It doesn't matter if we're talking about implementing technology, it doesn't matter if we're talking about strategic planning sessions, it doesn't matter if we're talking about process optimization or quality management or inventory, management. None of that stuff matters. It all starts right with a conversation with people, unpacking what they're struggling against, and then facilitating ways to hear their ideas, implement those ideas, take the good from those ideas, pull other ideas together, and then try a different iteration of those same ideas. Right?
Mm,
That's all we're doing from a leadership perspective. That's all people want to do is they want to come in, they want to contribute, they want to go home and do their thing. Right?
right.
So that to me is the essence of all of this stuff. And how do you get started, right? Like I'll kind of famously say, like, I was a terrible leader when I was young because I grew up in a family business. I, was a 20-year-old kid that really didn't know anything, that was responsible for, 40, 50, 60-year-old people that have been doing this forever. And, here's me thinking like, oh yeah, I got all of the ideas. I know how we're going to fix this. I know how we're going to improve this. And lo and behold, once I started to open myself up to saying like, boy, if I could share what I'm trying to do with people, get their feedback and understand what are they struggling with, put all of that together and help prioritize the things that we try, right? Like, boy, wouldn't you know how much faster we can move the needle? And that was the genesis of all of this stuff, and I've always loved technology. So then that piece came in of, how do we now take that planning people process? How do we, ultimately enable those things to do it more efficiently with less waste, with, better quality. So yeah, that's the kind of genesis of all of, what I believe in and what I do on a daily basis. And I think that's the core of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great overview of how change can and should get managed in organizations. And just sort of as a capstone, I just realized how long we've been
Yeah,
going here. I totally lost track of time, I'll be honest. But
sorry.
no, that's all right. It's a fun conversation, and that's why I lost track of time. But just as sort of a capstone question, though, in addition to what you were just saying about change and people, what other what sort of closing advice would you give to a manufacturer that's just sort of struggling with or just trying to figure out the path forward in 2025 and beyond? Like, where should they start? How do they start with that planning part of the planning process, people side of things that you talk about?
Yeah, I think the kind of gap analysis from a strategic perspective. So the question I'd be asking is, how are we growing today? Are we growing today? How do we want to grow? Again, I go back to those conversations around, do we have opportunities to increase margin today? If we do, we don't really need to talk about sales and marketing. We don't really need to talk about, all of these kind of external pieces, acquisition strategy, all of those things. Those can certainly be a part of the conversation. But if we've got opportunity to increase margin, if we've got opportunity to increase cash flow, if we have company culture issues, those are all internal things that we can do through continuous improvement. We can do through one of a number of initiatives and tools, right? So understanding that in terms of how do we want to grow, what are our opportunities? I think that's the ultimate starting point. That's where I like to start my conversations with folks because that gives me better context and perspective to say like, okay, well, maybe, we should be looking at, a digital transformation project. Maybe we've, dialed everything in and now we've got to take a look at what new things are out in the marketplace that we can ultimately lever, to enable that growth, right? If the focus is around strategic, acquisitions, that's a different conversation because we have to be worried about integration. We have to understand what kind of companies do we want to grow with? Is this a complementary product line? Is this a competing product line? Those are two different integration conversations. What's the company culture like at the companies that we're, ultimately taking a look at? How is that going to fit into what we're trying to do here? Do we have all of our internal things, built out to where we want them to be before we start to go on that? Are we looking at pure play growth from a sales and marketing perspective, new products, new, again, just straight up sales and marketing initiatives to grow our existing product line? So that's where I'd be starting talking, to the senior leadership team, starting to unpack some of those questions, and then from there you can start to spider web down and get to the meat of the how. But that will start helping you with why are we doing this? What do we anticipate is going to be the impact? Then we
Yeah.
can figure out how we're going to actually do it.
Yeah, sort of a little bit more of a top-down approach, even though it's not always cool to talk about top-down management, but you kind of have to start with that overall strategy, and that's been a theme of what you shared with us here today.
Yeah, I mean, look, from a pure play change perspective, it has to be driven, from the bottom up in terms of getting people along. But if you, from a leadership perspective, if you have no strategic vision, if you don't have the goal, if you don't have the bounds, what are you going to tell people that you're trying to do, right? Like, you can't tell people we need to change unless there's something driving that, right? So if you recognize from a leadership perspective and your strategic vision is, look, we know based on benchmarking that, our net profit is single digits and we should be double digits, that now becomes the strategic direction. We believe, based on benchmarking, that we can be a double digit net profitability organization. We believe that we can do that in the next 6 months. We believe we can do that in the next 18 months. Why do we want to do that? Well, if we are able to do that, we will be able to, increase wages. We'll be, and you start going down that path, right? All of that has to happen before you can start to unpack for people, like, how can we come along this journey with you, right? If you have no vision, there's a great quote about that I'm gonna, butcher, but it's like, without any direction, it's like the people will perish. It's like, yeah, of course, because we have no idea what we're marching towards. You,
Right.
you have to have direction.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great closing comment, having direction. And Jason on LinkedIn echoes the sentiment too. Vision and purpose, great points. I totally agree with that. And then want to do a quick shameless self promotion here. This is from William on YouTube. He says, Stratosphere, looking forward to it. Better be good
Nice.
or you. So Stratosphere is a conference we're hosting. I'll put up the QR code here. So you can scan and learn more in the right here, top left side of your screen. You can scan that to see the agenda. You can register. You can join in person or virtually. So love to see you there. It's actually next week, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday of next week. And what's funny about William's comment here, he says, looking forward to it. Better be good or you. I feel like he was starting to have like a threat in there. Like, it better be good or else we're going to have problems. So I feel all this pressure now. And now I'm wondering, what's going to happen if this isn't good?
Yeah.
And he's not
It's
happy
a
about it.
mystery.
We'll find out. Well, hopefully I won't find out.
Yeah,
What
I
it
was
is
gonna
bad.
say, careful what you wish for there.
Right. No, but thanks for that comment, William, and thanks for being here today, Dave. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
It's been great conversation. Time flew by, and I'd love to have you back on again to talk more about this stuff. But
Yeah,
where can people?
love
What's the
to.
best way to learn about you, to connect with you, all that good stuff?
Yeah, super active on LinkedIn. You can find me there, Dave Chrysler. You can also visit the our website, which is thechryslerclub.com. Yeah, happy to have a conversation with anybody. Love to network. Love to talk about this stuff. And thanks for having me on, Eric. Is really a great conversation. I know we share so much in terms of thought process and in kind of direction for these things. It's always a great conversation.
It is, and that's the beauty of social media and video these days. Is we got on this, and I realized, wait, we've never actually talked. I mean, I
Yeah.
feel like I know you. You feel like you know me because we're both active on social media. But that's the beauty of it. Is I feel like we had a connection before even chatting here today. So thank you for being here. Really appreciate it, and thank you to the audience for the great questions here. Again, we're going to edit this. We'll add a little bit more content to it. It'll become part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast that will be released. The episode that this will be featured on will be released in 2 to 3 weeks from now, but every Wednesday we put out new episodes. You can go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to learn more about that. And again, every Tuesday, same time, same place, we have different guests talking about different topics related to digital transformation. So be sure to check it out. Thanks everyone for being here today.